This video is only meant to supplement the written instructions. Please fully read and understand the entire included directions before beginning. Professional installation is required. A 2-post lift is recommended for the installation, but you can install on the ground using jack stands under the frame rails. Use a 21 mm to remove the front wheels. If your vehicle is equipped with a splash guard, use a 10 mm to remove and discard. Disconnect the lower end of the sway bar links from the lower control arm using an 18 mm. Using a 21 mm, remove the nut from the tie rod end, and using the appropriate puller tool, remove the tie rod from the knuckle. If you do not have a puller tool, you can use a hammer by very carefully striking the tie rod boss of the knuckle. Do not strike the tie rod end. Unclip the vacuum lines from the brake line bracket using a plastic fastener removal tool or screwdriver. Locate the brake line bracket on the steering knuckle and remove using a 10 mm. Remove the ABS sensor wire from the steering knuckle using an 8 mm. Use a 21 mm to unbolt the brake caliper and remove from the rotor. Secure it away from the work area. Do not let the calipers hang from the brake lines. Remove the front rotor from the hub. Using a chisel or flathead screwdriver and hammer, remove the CV shaft dust cap from the outside of the hub assembly. Using a 13 mm, remove the retaining nut from the CV shaft. Use an 8 mm to remove the 3 bolts holding the dust shield on the knuckle. Using a 5 mm Allen key, remove the ABS sensors from the top of the hub assembly. Use a plastic fastener removal tool to remove the vacuum lines from the vacuum module. Loosen, but do not remove the upper control arm bolts. The bolt is an 18 mm and the nut is a 21 mm. Remove the nuts from the upper and lower ball joints. Then, using the appropriate puller tool, disconnect the ball joints from the knuckle. If you do not have a puller tool, you can use a hammer by very carefully striking the ball joint boss of the knuckle. Do not strike the ball joints. For the upper ball joint, you'll need an 18 mm, and for the lower ball joint, you'll need a 21 mm. Remove the knuckle from the vehicle. Locate the brake line bracket on the side of the upper control arm mount and use a 10 mm to remove. Loosen but do not remove the 2 lower control arm bolts. There are 2 on the driver's side and 2 on the passenger side. The bolt is a 21 mm and the nut is a 27 mm. Using an 18 mm, remove the 2 nuts from the lower strut studs and let the lower control arm swing out of the way. Using an 18 mm, remove the 3 nuts from the top of the strut. Unclip the wire fastener to access the rear nut. Remove the strut from the vehicle. Remove the lower control arm bolts, then remove the lower control arm. If equipped, use a 13 mm to remove the factory front differential skid plate and discard. Using a 15 mm, remove 4 nuts retaining the sway bar body. Remove the stud plates from each side and retain for later use. Then remove the sway bar from the vehicle. Mark the orientation of the front drive shaft using a marker or paint pen. Then, using a 10 mm, disconnect it from the differential. Discard the bolts and retain the washer plates. Secure the drive shaft up out of the way. Do not let it hang. Remove the 4 bolts securing the rear crossmember and remove the rear crossmember. The bolt will be 15 mm and the nut will be 18 mm. Disconnect vacuum line from differential located on the top of the center section towards the middle of the vehicle. The driver's side rear lower control arm crossmember mount has to be trimmed on all models to allow clearance for the front drive shaft. If equipped with the second generation 3.5-liter EcoBoost V6 and the new 10R80 10-speed automatic transmission, shown here, this mount has to be trimmed before the differential can be removed due to the clearance in between the differential and the oil pan. On other engines, the differential can be removed first, then the crossmember mount can be trimmed. Start on the rear side and measure from the inside of the bracket out 5.5 inches and mark. Using a square, mark a line up and over the bracket, maintaining the 5.5-inch distance from the inside edge. It may be useful to make a mark on both sides. Cut the bracket along the marked lines using a cutoff wheel, sawzall, or plasma torch. After cutting, you will need to clean and paint all exposed areas to prevent rust. Making sure to support the differential with a jack, remove the rear driver's side differential bolt. Then remove the two front bolts. The driver's side rear bolt will be 21 mm and the driver's side front bolt will be 18 mm. The passenger side bolt is 18 mm as well. Carefully remove the differential assembly. The passenger side differential drop bracket has notches. The driver's side does not. Loosely attach the driver's side front differential drop bracket to the differential using the supplied 9/16 inch by 3 3/4 inch hardware. Install the bolt from the front. Do not tighten at this time. Make sure the offset is facing the front of the vehicle. The passenger side differential bracket has notches in the top. Loosely attach the passenger side differential drop bracket to the frame using the factory hardware. Install the bolt from the front. Leave loose for now. Make sure the offset is facing the front of the vehicle. Position the front of the driver differential bracket into the frame using factory hardware. Install the bolt from the front. Then pivot the differential into the passenger side differential bracket and secure. Install the bolt from the rear and secure using supplied bolts, washer, and nut. Hand tighten only. Attach the hose adapter to the new vacuum hose. Then attach the hose adapter to the factory hose. Connect the new hose to the differential. Position the sway bar brackets on the frame using the supplied 7/16 inch by 1 inch bolts, washers, and nuts. Snug, but do not tighten. Raise the rear crossmember into position. Secure it to the frame using the supplied 18 mm by 150 mm bolts, washers, and nuts. Install the bolts from the rear. Install the supplied 9/16 inch by 3 3/4 inch bolt, washer, and nut from the rear through the sway bar bracket, differential rear mount, and the rear crossmember. Do not tighten at this time. Position the front crossmember into the frame using the factory hardware. Install the bolts from the front. Leave hand tight for now. Install the lower control arm into the new crossmembers with the supplied alignment cam bolts and nuts. Make sure the cam washers fit between the control tabs on the crossmembers. The cam washer should be in the up or neutral position. Snug, but do not tighten. You will need a 27 mm to snug the bolt up. Tighten and torque the bolts in the order that they are shown. Refer back to the instructions or pause and back the video up for torque specs and fastener sizes if needed. Snug the sway bar drop brackets to the frame. Do not tighten. You'll need a 5/8 inch for the bolt and an 11/16 inch for the nut. Secure the rear crossmember mounting bolts to the frame with a 27 mm. Next, tighten the rear differential mounting bolt to the rear crossmember. The bolt is 13/16 inch and the nut is 7/8 inch. Using an 18 mm, tighten the front differential brackets to the frame. Next, tighten the front differential brackets to the differential. The bolt is 13/16 inch, and the nut is 7/8 inch. Tighten the sway bar brackets to the frame. The bolts will be 5/8 inch, and the nut will be 11/16 inch. Tighten the front crossmember to the frame. The bolt will be 21 mm, and the nut will be 27 mm. Install the belly pan to the front and rear crossmembers, using the supplied 3/8 inch by 1 inch bolts and nuts. Tighten using a 9/16 inch wrench. Install the front driveshaft spacer. Make sure to install with the factory washer plates. Make sure to apply thread locker to the supplied 10 mm by 90 mm socket head bolts. Install, making sure that the orientation marks that were made previously are aligned. Use an 8 mm Allen to tighten. Attach the sway bar body to the new drop brackets using the factory hardware. Use a 15 mm to tighten. Position the strut spacers on the top of the factory strut and fasten using the factory hardware. Tighten with an 18 mm. Install the strut assembly into the strut mount and attach using the supplied 10 mm flange nut. Start the nut, but do not tighten. Reattach the lower strut mount to the lower control arm using the factory hardware. Tighten the 3 top strut spacer 10 mm flange nuts with a 15 mm wrench. On the factory knuckle, note the orientation of the vacuum module and hub bearing assembly. Then remove them from the factory knuckle. There are 3 8 mm bolts securing the vacuum assembly and 4 18 mm bolts securing the hub bearing assembly. Install the new knuckle into the hub bearing assembly. Apply thread locker to the factory hardware and then install the bolts. Tighten with an 18 mm wrench. Position the vacuum assembly on the knuckle and secure using the factory hardware. Use an 8 mm to tighten. Position the new knuckles on the lower control arm ball joint while sliding the CV shaft onto the new knuckle. Install the factory nut onto the lower control arm ball joint. Use a 21 mm to tighten the lower ball joint nut. Pay close attention to the CV shaft engagement and make sure it is fully seated in the hub assembly. Install the factory nut and tighten using a 13 mm. Attach the upper ball joint to the knuckle and tighten with an 18 mm. Tighten the lower strut mount nuts using an 18 mm. Install the new brake line brackets on the frame using the factory hardware with a 10 mm. Use the bracket as a template to drill a 7/32 inch hole and install the 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch self-tapping bolt. Use a 3/8 inch to tighten. Remove the ABS sensor line from the clips holding it to the brake line brackets. Carefully bend the brake lines to reattach the factory brake line bracket to the new one using the supplied 5/16 inch by 3/4 inch bolt, washer, and nut. Tighten with a 1/2 inch. Make sure you do not kink the lines. Make sure the ABS sensor line is free and not tangled in the brake line or the vacuum line. Reconnect the ABS sensor to the hub assembly and tighten using a 5 mm Allen. Install the dust shield and secure using the factory hardware. Use an 8 mm to tighten. Reinstall the dust cap. Install the rotor Installing a factory lug nut will help hold the rotor in position to install the caliper. Position the caliper over the rotor. Apply thread locker to the factory bolts. Then use a 21 mm to tighten. Connect the brake line bracket to the steering knuckle using the factory hardware. Tighten using a 10 mm. Connect the vacuum lines to the vacuum module. Use a lubricant to reposition the ABS sensor wire bracket so that it attaches to the knuckle with plenty of slack on both ends. Connect the ABS sensor wire to the knuckle using the factory hardware. Tighten with an 8 mm. Make sure the wire is positioned below the bolt. Inspect the brake line, ABS sensor wire, and vacuum lines to ensure they are routed correctly and that they are secure in a way that allows movement throughout the steering and suspension cycle. Attach the tie rod end to the knuckle. Then tighten with a 21 mm. Connect the sway bar links to the lower control arm. Then use a 15 mm to tighten. Now let's move on to the rear end. Remove the rear wheels. Remove the shock absorbers. The bolt is a 15 mm and the nut is an 18 mm. Use a 10 mm to unbolt the factory brake line bracket from the frame. Unclip the axle vent hose from the bottom of the truck bed. Use a 13 mm to remove the rear bump stops from the frame. Use a jack to support the rear axle and remove the U-bolts using a 21 mm. Discard the U-bolts. Lower the axle and remove the factory block. Install the new lift blocks. The pin should be offset to the front of the vehicle. There is an indicator notch in the block that should face the front of the vehicle. Make sure the locating pins are seated correctly. Jack the axle back into position while making sure that the axle pins are seated correctly into the block. Install the new U-bolts using the supplied 9/16" washers and nuts. Tighten with a 7/8" using an X pattern. Use a 10 mm to install the new brake line extension bracket to the frame using the factory hardware. Use the bracket as a template to drill a 9/32" hole and install the 5/16" by 1 inch self-tapping bolt. Make sure the new hole is below and forward of the factory hole in the frame. Tighten using a 1/2 inch. Carefully bend the brake lines to attach the factory brake line bracket to the new bracket using the supplied 5/16" by 1 inch bolt, washer, and nut. Do not kink the lines. Tighten with a 1/2 inch. Attach the vent hose to the underside of the truck. Superlift offers multiple shock absorbers. We went with the Bilstein 5100 series on this build. Install the supplied 3/4 inch OD by 1/2 inch ID by 1.54 inch sleeves into the upper and lower shock bushings. Bilstein 5100 series shocks can be mounted shaft up or shaft down. Install with factory hardware. The bolt is 15 mm and the nut is 18 mm. Position the new bump stop spacers on the top of the factory bump stop and attach to the frame using the supplied 10 mm by 150 mm bolt and washer. Tighten using a 17 mm. Install the tires and wheels, making sure to tighten the lug nuts in a star pattern. Use a 21 mm to tighten. Lower the vehicle to the ground. With the suspension supporting the vehicle weight, tighten the lower control arm mounting bolts with a 27 mm. Make sure the cam bolt is in the up position. Tighten the upper control arm bolts with a 21mm and an 18mm. The lift kit install is now complete, but you'll need to take care of several things for safe vehicle operation. Have a professional wheel alignment performed. Check the four-wheel drive system. Adjust the headlights to proper settings. Install the included warning to driver decal within the driver's view. After the first 100 miles, check all fasteners for tightness, and then every 1,000 miles thereafter. If you have any questions or would like more info, go to superlift.com.